and I'm very honored to introduce to you Professor Francesca Lapenta. He is a representative of Boston Global Forum in Rome. He is a director of Institute of John Cabot University and Institute for Future Research Study, and also he AI expert, AI strategy, AI policy, and he's my dear friend also. And he today will moderate this special talk of history of AI, and I am very honored to introduce Professor Jürgen Schmidhuber. He one pioneer of AI. Many people name him as one of father of machine learning, modern machine learning, deep learning, something like that. And today we have chance to discuss with him about his recently writing and a piece for history of AI. So we are thank you very much for Francesco Lapenta and Professor Jürgen Schmidhuber. And now, yeah, Francesco, yeah. And this is I would like to remind again, this is a official talk of history of AI initiative as Boston Global Forum and AIWS Society, AIWS. Thank you. Have a great time today. Thank you.
All right. So thank you, Tuan. So first of all, let me say what an honor and pleasure is for me to have the opportunity to have this conversation with Professor Jürgen Schmidhuber, who's to anybody that is in the field of artificial intelligence is a bit of a myth. Is certainly considered one of the fathers of the evolution of artificial intelligence as we know it today. Neural networks is certainly the area for which is mostly known. And the Boston Global Forum initiative on the history of AI has a profound mission, is that of recognizing the individuals and the stepping stones of the long history of artificial intelligence that is coming to be publicly known only lately, but as you, Jürgen, have really accounted so nicely in your annotated history of modern AI and deep learning, it's actually rooted in many decades of research and advancement in artificial intelligence and computing and research in the field. And it's mostly unknown to most people who think that artificial intelligence is something that has been developed only lately. So I think it's a really wonderful opportunity to be able to talk with one of the fathers of artificial intelligence and to reflect on the history of artificial intelligence, and also to elaborate a little bit on the future of artificial intelligence. Just an introduction of Professor Jürgen Schmidhuber. It's a very difficult task to synthesize all the things that have been accomplished. All I can say is that he is certainly at the forefront of and one of the leading researchers in the field of artificial intelligence, and is very often referred to as the father of neural networks research. He's a renowned and groundbreaking contributor to deep learning. His articles, I think 600 articles and plus publications. Some of those are, especially a couple, are probably the most referred articles in artificial intelligence and neural networks in the history so far. His groundbreaking research has been recognized in many ways, has received numerous awards and honors, including, for example, the Helmholtz Award for the International Neural Network Society, the IEEE Neural Network Pioneer Award, the Neural Network Pioneer Award from the IEEE Computational Intelligence Society. And his work is absolutely not stopping. We know how also groundbreaking and successful his contributions have been to the industry. Many of his works and development have been powering all known applications in artificial intelligence, from Google to Facebook applications, Meta applications, Siri applications, and whatnot. So it's a real pleasure for me to give you the floor for what I guess is going to be a 20 minutes presentation, and I'm looking forward to have a dialogue about your presentation afterwards. So the floor is yours, Jürgen, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Francesco and Tuan, for these very kind words and these exaggerations. And thank you for mentioning this recent report that I wrote about the annotated history of modern AI and deep learning. Machine learning, which is my specialty, is really the science of credit assignment. And this new survey credits the pioneers of deep learning and modern AI, and it's supplementing my older 2015 deep learning survey, which won an award from the journal Neural Networks, which already has 800 references, but this new one is adding some, because some of the things that happened since then require, again, a certain repositioning of the history that we have experienced so far. Some things have become less important, other things have become more important. And I will say a few words about that. And finally, to round it off, the survey also puts things in a broader historic context spanning the time since the Big Bang until when the universe is going to be many times older than it is now. And maybe we'll have a little bit of time to talk about that. Now, generally speaking, over time, certain historic events have become more important in the eyes of certain beholders. In particular, the Big Bang from 13.8 billion years ago is now widely considered an essential moment in the history of everything. Until a few decades ago, however, it has remained completely unknown to Earthlings, who for a long time have entertained quite erroneous ideas about the origins of the universe, and currently accepted histories of many more limited subjects are results of similarly radical revisions. And here I will focus on the history of AI, which also isn't what it used to be. A history of AI written in the 1980s would have emphasized topics such as theorem proving, which is something that started with Gödel's work in 1931, logic programming, expert systems, heuristic search. And this would have been in line with topics of a 1956 conference in Dartmouth, where the term AI, just the name AI, was coined by John McCarthy. But practical AI dates back at least to 1914, when Leonardo Torres y Quivira, the Spanish guy, built the first working chess endgame player. And back then, chess was considered as an activity restricted to the realms of intelligent creatures. And AI theory, so not practical AI, but AI theory, dates back at least to 1931 to 1934, when Kurt Gödel himself identified fundamental limits of any type of computation-based artificial intelligence and computation in general. Now, a history of AI written in the early 2000s would have put more emphasis on topics such as support vector machines and kernel methods and Bayesian reasoning, which probably should be called Laplacian reasoning, actually, or maybe Saundersonian reasoning, according to historians of science, and it would have focused on decision trees and ensemble methods and swarm intelligence and evolutionary computation. Why? Because back then, such techniques drove many of the most successful AI applications. But now, 20 years later, a history of AI written in the 2020s must emphasize concepts such as the even older chain rule, which goes back to 1676. And deep nonlinear artificial neural networks trained by gradient descent, in particular recurrent networks, where there are feedback connections, which make these recurrent neural networks general purpose computers, which can run any program that you can run on your laptop. Why does history have to experience such a re-emphasis on certain things and de-emphasis on other things? Because many of the most famous and most commercial recent AI applications depend on these techniques. So the recent neural network concepts that have become so dominant in modern AI are actually conceptually close to topics of the Macy conferences in the 40s and early 50s, and the 1951 Paris conference on calculating machines and human thought. And now this Paris conference of 1951 is often viewed as the first conference on AI, although they didn't use the name AI. Much of what's now called AI back then was still called cybernetics, with a focus very much in line with modern AI based on deep learning with deep artificial neural networks, which have become so successful in thousands of applications that everybody has now on his smartphone in his pocket. So some of the past neural network research, but actually not all of it, was inspired by the human brain. In the human brain, you have roughly 100 billion neurons, each connected to maybe 10,000 other neurons on average. And some of them are input neurons that feed the rest with data, like sound and vision and tactile sensor data, and others are output neurons that control the muscles, and most neurons are hidden in between these input and output neurons, and we like to call them hidden units, and that's where thinking takes place. And your brain apparently learns by changing the strengths or weights of these connections, which determine how strongly does this neuron over here influence that neuron over there in the next time step. And so in the beginning, all these connections are random, but then over time, through some of them through learning get strong and others get weaker. And that's how the whole network then suddenly can do all kinds of interesting things, such as recognizing speech or driving a car and so on. Now, how is it possible that neural networks can learn all of that by making these connections stronger and weaker? What my survey is about is to highlight essential historic contributions that made that possible. And since basically all of the fundamental concepts of modern AI were derived in previous millennia, in the last millennium, the section titles that I have in the survey emphasize developments only up to the year 2000, but then within these sections, I'm also mentioning very recent papers that really exploit these principles, profiting from the fact that every 5 years, compute is getting 10 times cheaper. And this means that every 30 years, compute is getting 1 million times cheaper. And that's an old trend that has started, as far as I can tell, in the year 1941, when Konrad Zuse built the first general purpose computer that really could be programmed to do essentially anything, except for storage limitations, which we still have in today's computers. And back then he could do maybe 1 operation per second, but then, you know, every 30 years a factor of 1 million. So today we can do millions of billions of operations per second for the same price, and that has made a big difference. And that's the reason why now in your smartphones you have artificial neural networks that work really well, but whose basic principles have been developed, invented and developed in the previous millennium. So it's a little bit like the cars which were invented in the 20th century and in the 19th century, I'm sorry, in the late 1800s, in the 19th century, but then the 20th century brought numerous improvements of these cars, and that's why today's cars look different from those of 150 years ago, and are more powerful and more efficient and can do all kinds of things that they couldn't do back then. Right. So that is a little introduction. Let me now maybe jump right there to these, in my point of view, most important breakthroughs in recent centuries that led to what we now call deep learning and modern AI. And one essential concept was created 1676. That was the chain rule. The chain rule is something that was published by Leibniz, and when he published it, he had a sign error in the derivation. And later, L'Hopital, a French mathematician who wrote a summary and papers about this publication of Leibniz, he fixed that. Why is the chain rule important? Because neurons in deep artificial neural networks, they work like that. Each neuron is a differentiable function of inputs that are coming from other neurons, which in turn are different differentiable functions of even older neurons that provided input signals to the neuron, which is now computing its differentiable function of the previous input, and so on. And then you get these long chains of credit assignment that you have to perform as you're trying to figure out how much does this neuron at the end of the chain change if I change a little bit the parameter of one of these neurons early in the chain. And that's what the chain rule is able to compute. So it's essential, it's simple calculus that you have to understand for computing that, and it really goes back hundreds of years. Then some people think that neural networks as we know them today, they were maybe invented in the 20th century, but no, this really started around 1800 when Legendre, French mathematician, and Carl Friedrich Gauss, when they had the first linear networks, the first linear neural networks as they would be called today, but back then they weren't called linear neural networks, they were called the method of least squares and linear regression, that's what they were called. But it's just the name that has changed because the devices that they had back then looked exactly like what we call linear neural networks today. You have inputs and you have outputs, and in between you have connections, and on these connections there are weights, and then you have an error function, which is exactly the error function that people use today like crazy, and you have a way of adjusting the weights such that the error, the difference between what this network computes and what it should compute is minimized. Oh, it's exactly mathematically the same thing, just the name has changed. Then, more recently, in the 1920s, between 1920 and 1925, the first recurrent neural networks emerged. And recurrent neural networks are really important because without these feedback connections, you don't have general purpose computers in form of neural networks. So you need these feedback connections to make them general purpose such that they can base their current computations on previous computations. The first architectures of this type were created in physics by Lenz and Ising in the 20s. So the Ising model, as many call it, that was published in 1925, and its properties were analyzed. And then it took several decades until this non-learning recurrent neural network architecture was made adaptive. And the guy who did that was in Japan, Shunichi Amari. In 1972, he published this learning recurrent network, which 10 years later was republished and later has been called the Harpfield network, although it should be called the Amari network. And then in 1958, another important concept was created by Rosenblatt. Rosenblatt had a multi-layer feed-forward perceptron. He is maybe more famous for something called a perceptron, but the perceptron is just a single layer device, which is a lot like the old linear networks from 1800 by Gauss and Legendre, except that it has a threshold function attached to it, such that it can do classification, either yes or no, for example, in response to these inputs. And what I like about Rosenblatt's work is something that goes beyond that, because Rosenblatt also had deeper multi-layer perceptrons. In particular, he had a network which was had two layers. The first had the inputs come in, and then there are randomized weights which are randomly initialized, and they lead to a particular internal representation. And then on top of that, you have a learning perceptron, as it is called, a linear network on top of that, which then can compute stuff that without this hidden layer you couldn't compute. You can classify stuff that without this hidden layer you can't classify. That was done in 1958. Multi-layer perceptrons. It was no deep learning yet. Why not? Because only the last layer learned. The previous layer didn't learn. Nevertheless, it was something that is now called extreme learning machines, which was published many decades later without referring to Rosenblatt's work. So Rosenblatt deserves all the credit for that. And then the real deep learning started in the Ukraine, of all places, in 1965, when Ivanenko and Lapa for the first time had really deep networks where all the layers in these networks learned. And they had an incremental way of training each layer based on the errors that were achieved with the network up to this most recent layer that they hadn't trained yet. So through this incremental layer-wise training, they could solve all kinds of interesting problems that you couldn't solve with one layer, simple flat networks. And just a few years later, Amari again in Japan, 1967, 1968. For the first time, he had deep multi-layer perceptrons that learned end-to-end, not layer by layer, but end-to-end through gradient descent, through stochastic gradient descent, actually, which is a method that was proposed in 1951 by Robbins and Monroe. So a variant of gradient descent, which stochastically, based on experience, measures the gradients and produces changes of the weights such that on average the whole network is improving. And that was 67. You know, this is now more than half a century old. So deep learning through stochastic gradient descent really started in Japan in the late 60s, which is amazing, because in 1969, Marvin Minsky and Papert, they wrote a book about the limitations of flat learning, and apparently they didn't know that deep learning already existed. The 1965 work by Ivanenko and Lapa, and then a few years later, the stochastic gradient descent work by Amari, they were not aware of that apparently. So that's how deep learning started. And then in the 70s, another very important concept was created again in Japan, interestingly, by Kunohiko Fukushima, which is the thing that is now called a convolutional neural network architecture, where you have a network which has convolutional filters that are are shifted across an image, for example, such that you get feature detectors, which then are downsampled in the next layer. So you have alternating convolutional and downsampling layers. And this architecture turned out to be really useful for computer vision. Fukushima did not combine that with gradient descent. He had other ways of training it. But then Alex Weibel in Japan in 1987, he combined networks with convolutions and gradient descent, and that's how this line of research started. Yeah. Then the 80s and 90s brought lots of applications of these older concepts to networks, which today would be called graph neural networks, and something that is now called dropout, that was invented by Hansen, and he called it the stochastic delta rule. So dropout is a variant of that, if you know what I'm talking about. Otherwise, never mind. And recurrent neural networks were studied in many ways, and the limitations of recurrent neural networks back then were analyzed. And then, and then in the around 1990, our own little miraculous year started, and we were able to make a couple of nice contributions. For example, we had in 1990 something which is now called generative adversarial neural networks, and we call it Curiosity, where one network is fighting another network as one network is generating actions, probabilistically generating actions, learning to improve these probability distributions over the actions. Another one is looking at the outputs of this first network, and is trying to predict the reactions of the environment. And the environment is therefore being modeled by the second network. And now the first network wants to generate data which the second network finds surprising. So the second network is minimizing exactly the same error function that the first one is maximizing. And this concept has become very popular also for creating fake images of real people and stuff like that. So, I forgot something really important, which happened in 1970, shortly after Shunichi Amari did the gradient descent, the stochastic gradient descent, because that's when in Finland, Seppo Linnainmaa developed what is now called backpropagation. 1970, it's also known as the reverse mode of automatic differentiation. And that's when you have a deep network and you have differentiable functions on your nodes, and then you want to know how much do I have to change this connection here, the parameter on this connection here, to get a certain output on this output of the entire, to get a certain change of the output of the entire system. So again, this chain of credit assignment has to be implemented there. And basically, this method of Linnainmaa, which is now called backpropagation or reverse mode of automatic differentiation, is implementing the chain rule of 1676 by Leibniz in an efficient way for these deep networks, such that the forward pass through the network costs exactly the same computationally as the backward pass. So there are many ways of implementing the chain rule, and some of them are very inefficient, but that is the efficient way of implementing it. And that's what is now widely used to train neural networks. The first guy who really applied that to neural networks was in 1982, Paul Werbers. And then other people used it for many applications. And today it's widely used. It's one of the basic ingredients, the basic tools of all of neural network research. Yeah, and so in 1990, then our good year when we not only had these adversarial networks, but then also something which is now called transformers with linearized self-attention. So if you know what a transformer is, ChatGPT, which is a famous recent program that has taken the world by storm, is based on something called a transformer, which is a particular neural network, which has a clever way of translating inputs into desired outputs. And I'm happy that it's so successful, because 1991, I had something which is now called a transformer with linearized self-attention. Back then, I called it a fast weight controller. One network controlling the weights of another artificial neural network, where the first network is slowly learning through backpropagation to manipulate the second network, which has fast weights, and it can rapidly, within a millisecond, completely change its mapping because of the keys and values which are sent to the second network through the first network, which learns to send good keys and values to it, such that it deals with the incoming inputs and the incoming queries in a way that minimizes whatever error it wants to minimize. So that, in hindsight, was an important thing. Another important thing that happened back then was the diploma thesis of my brilliant student, Sepp Hochreiter, whose first job was to implement unsupervised pre-training, another method which comes out of this miraculous year, where we were able to greatly facilitate deep learning by unsupervised pre-training and compressing long sequences of data into short sequences, such that the whole deep learning problem became easier. But what Sepp then did, he also analyzed the reason why deep learning usually is so difficult, and it's this so-called vanishing gradient problem, which is the central problem of deep learning, I'd say. And then there were also ways of overcoming it, and this led to what is now called long short-term memory, which is on your smartphone, and since 2015 has done the speech recognition on that. So many of the important things go back to this year 1990, 1991. Yeah, this is a little bit a focus on this pattern recognition aspect of deep learning, but then there's also the even more important type of learning, which is called reinforcement learning, where you don't have a teacher who tells your system what to do at which point in time. So instead, in the reinforcement learning, the neural network itself has to figure out what to do at which point in time to get, in the end, a lot of reward and to experience only little pain. And all kinds of combinations of previous methods which were invented in the much earlier, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, like Monte Carlo tree sampling and all kinds of tree search and also beam search and all kinds of techniques which are not really neural network based were combined with neural networks. Dynamic programming was combined with neural networks in a way that is now called temporal difference learning, and many other techniques, policy gradient, stochastic gradient descent, were combined with recurrent neural networks in a way that really today, as computers much more powerful than back then, allow us to create superhuman video game players and things like that. So there is this whole branch of learning to act without a teacher, which is essential for modern AI, and which is actually basically combining neural networks and other techniques which have been popular before neural networks have become really popular in recent decades. Now, finally, we really should emphasize again that all of this would not have been possible, the recent successes would not have been possible without the continual acceleration of hardware. I mentioned before, every 5 years, computers getting 10 times cheaper, and that's an old trend. And if we don't acknowledge that, and in my report, in my survey, you will find an acknowledgement of hardware developments going back 2,000 years, actually, until the 1900s and 2000s. If we don't acknowledge the importance of this acceleration of hardware, we are omitting a serious aspect of why AI is working so well today. But I don't have time to go into the details of all of that. So for now, I think we should stop for a moment. And if there are particular questions that go deeper into one of the aspects that I briefly mentioned, I'll be happy to try to answer those.
So Jürgen, thank you. First of all, let me tell you how amazing it's been for me to read your Annotated History of Modern AI and Deep Learning, and to have you to present some highlights of the article that I recommend everybody to read. Basically, is available online and will be linked in the video that we are making with this presentation. No? And I have a personal reason why I was particularly really intrigued in reading your work, your latest work, and this article specifically, because it's not very common to have one of the fathers of the history of the technological development of AI to reflect on the history of AI. And there's many intriguing dimensions in your article. Myself, I've been studying the history of AI for perhaps the past 5 years. And in my latest book, I was specifically commenting on the history of AI, doing a little bit what you did, crediting some of the key ideas, but mine was a geopolitical analysis. So my question for you, for someone that is mostly recognized for his pivotal contribution to the field, solving the technical dimensions of it, I'm really curious to know what inspired you to write the history of AI, and how would you respond to the common perception that most people feel that it's a very recent development, and what role you believe that this historical context plays in our understanding of AI? What is the importance of properly crediting historical contributions to the development of AI, and why you believe is so crucial to the scientific community today and to the public to know this history? This was what intrigues me. What drove you to lay out this history? Why you think it's important?
Thank you for this question. I'll be happy to answer that. So actually, what I'm doing most of the time, machine learning, is really, really close to what historians do. What do historians do? They look at past data, and they are trying to find patterns in the past data, and they try to explain the reason why this happened through a combination of previous events. So they try to figure out the causal structure. They try to find patterns. To the extent that they can find patterns, they can also try to make predictions about the future and maybe say we should avoid this particular fault in the past to improve our future expected reward, for example, stuff like that. So what historians do is very, very much like what machine learning people do, because in machine learning, it's really the same thing. You take the past data, you try to find patterns and regularities, and our data, which is coming from this friendly universe, is very regular. Every electron apparently behaves more or less the same way, as if it was running the same subprogram all the time. So we, from little observations, we learn a lot about all kinds of things that haven't that we haven't observed, and we can make predictions. In friendly universes like this one, we can make predictions based on what we learned from the past, which means we can get an idea what would be good action sequence in the future to select a rewarding future. So we can use the predictions and the model of the world that we generate through these predictions based on the previous data. We can use that model of the world to improve future performance. And this is not only true for machine learning, it's also exactly true for physics. You know, what is physics about? Physics is about understanding previous events and then trying to figure out which are the really important things that happened and how did they lead to to later events, and how did the Big Bang cause certain conditions in the universe that then in turn led to, again, different conditions, which finally led to the first stars and the first planets and everything. So physics and other sciences are just doing the same thing. And actually, every single human is doing the same thing. In your own life, you are looking back at what you have experienced so far, and you're trying to find patterns and use those patterns to improve your own future. So in many ways, what historians and entire societies consisting of lots of historians writing all kinds of history books, what they are doing is very similar to what individuals are doing and what machine learning systems are doing. So it's the most natural connection in my point of view.
Thank you. This is so intriguing because, you know, I'm the director of an institute that is called Institute of Future Innovation Studies. And many times the question I receive is exactly what is it that you do? Are you reading in a sphere what the future is? And I say that, I mean, the job is a lot more methodological and mundane in a way, because whenever you look at events, those events are always rooted in the past, they evolved into the present, and these conditions coexist in the present and evolving in the future in a non-arbitrary way. Although it's unpredictable, it's not arbitrary because it's linked to the past. So anything that will happen in the future will have its roots in what is happening today and what has happened in the past. What is also intriguing about your discussion is the complexity in these forces that are building on one another. You seem to describe the complexity of many elements that contribute to the shaping of the future and the patterns that are being created by a number of events that might be perceived as not connected, but when observed under the right lens, will emerge as a part of greater patterns, which is a part of the most intriguing part of your article, is towards the end where you seem to draw conclusions about these patterns, but we'll get to that. But I have a question that is still related to what you just said, and to what do you write in your article. Can you explain to me in a little bit or expand what do you mean by credit assignment in the context of AI, and how do you think it helps AI systems to learn from historical data? Because you seem to make an argument for that there.
Yeah, so credit assignment in AI is just the same, following the same basic principles of science in general, because you also have the same credit assignment going on in mathematics and physics, and some guy maybe advances the state of the art, then the whole science system that we have on this planet is based on these incentives. So if you make a progress in a certain scientific field, then you also get some currency for it, some recognition or whatever, citations or whatever. And then the whole incentive-based system for all the scientists in the world is based on this type of currency. So it's a little bit different from the currency that you get in industry, where it's money, and the most successful guy is the one who has the most money. No, this is a system which is based on this honor code of science and the principles of scientific integrity. And to the extent that these principles are obeyed, the whole scientific endeavor works, has worked for centuries. And then, of course, it turns out that sometimes there's a version of history which has to be corrected. Just like machine learning systems correct themselves all the time, entire societies have versions of history which are wrong, but then over time they will be corrected, because the guys who are helping to correct it, they are also getting a reward for that. So they are incentivized to do that, and all of that contributes to uncovering the truth. So there's this thing, the facts and the truth, and sometimes the facts and the truth are hidden somewhere, But scientists basically are the guys who uncover the truth, and they destroy previous misconceptions. For example, there was a time just 100 years ago when people didn't know that the universe started in a certain way 13.8 billion years ago. But then within a few decades, many people have learned about this new type of history of the world, which is much broader than the history of AI that I'm currently focusing on. And so that's how truth incrementally is uncovered in all fields, not just in the history of the world, in the history of society, but also the history of physics and mathematics and AI and so on. And so here, my focus on something I'm very familiar with, the history of modern AI and deep learning, which has also been misrepresented in the past. For example, I mentioned briefly Minsky. Minsky, he wrote a book which sometimes is referred to as a killer of neural network research, because it basically debunked it basically criticized the limitations of shallow learning, although when the book was written, there already was deep learning in the Ukraine and in Japan. So it's something that some people don't know, and so I'm helping to spread the news, and it's another pattern that needs to be uncovered and then propagated, and then later additional patterns that I'm not even aware of right now will be uncovered, because history itself and credit assignment is a continual process, which means it's never over, but it's zooming in on this thing, which is the truth. And so in the end, the truth is always going to win. Sometimes it may take a little while, but in the end, you always will converge on the truth, because that's science, that's the nature of science, and also the historical sciences, and the nature of machine learning, and basically the nature of everything.
Thank you very much. It's very much, I'm glad that I think I understood the concept, because now that you explain it to me, it's resonating with my own interpretation of what you meant by it. And what I find intriguing is you're talking about this rewarding system that is throughout history given to a specific scientific advancement in general, and in AI specifically. And in my own area of interest, I'm specifically intrigued about the ethical reflections about the consequences of innovation. And this seems to be an emerging kind of field, because if you talk with engineers until a few years ago, they have always seen their own job as neutral, because the assumption is that science was neutral. But in reality, we know really well that it is not. And especially when you contextualize it in the way you do, there's a number of rewarding systems. The development, the credit, the investments are rewarded based on systems that are outside of technology, but based on ideology. So the investment in specific technology, if we look at the history of technology in general and AI specifically, is being rewarded in specific systems. Specific programs are financed, others are not. You are a very active voice, for example, in the field of AI for good, right? You're very vocal about that. So do you have any reflections about the contemporary shifts that sees technological innovation also as part of another form of reflection or innovation, which is the philosophical, ethical, moral dimensions of technology? And now these two seem to be embedded, and it seems like the history of all technologies have to be revised by including also these voices and the people have been reflecting on the consequences of technology and the innovation, for example. So what's your view on it?
Yes. Yeah, clearly, one aspect of the predictions that you can make, given the past observations, is the aspect of what's ethical and what should be done and what shouldn't be done. And if you look back, many of the advances in science and engineering were actually driven by conflicts, by wars. So there was a very utilitarian, what is the English word for that? Utilitaristic, is that the English word? I'm not sure.
Utilitarian.
Utilitarian aspect to it, which was very much about defeating the enemy, whoever was the enemy. So
this is really what I was pointing to, is that a lot of the modern innovation in technology is being driven by an ideology of conflict. Clearly, the First and Second World War created a very specific system where technological innovation has never been seen as neutral, but it's been seen as an active tool for world domination of specific geopolitical powers, leading the future of other countries by developing technological cycles in different emerging technologies, for example, in artificial intelligence. So this is really a modern problem, because in your more extended interpretation of, you can go from mathematics, physics, and all the knowledge that need to be produced to lead to development in machine learning and AI and computing in general. No? But there's been a shift in modernity, and now finally we are questioning it. So that's the intriguing part for me, and that's why I like the idea of credit assignment and credit systems, because it can be adapted to include new elements.
Yeah. Well, I think the predictions regarding ethical values are not recent. It goes back a long time, I believe. I always like to give the example of controlled fire, which was invented maybe 800,000 years ago. And back then, the humans who invented it, they realized the pros and cons of fire. And they realized, yes, fire can keep us warm at night, and we can cook with it, and we can extract more energy from the food, and that will allow us to have larger brains. Well, back then they didn't know that, but that's what happened in the end. And they also realized, however, that fire can be used to kill other people or to burn them. And they even realized that fire has this AI-like quality of spreading without further human ado in a wildfire. And back then, when people started realizing all these good and bad possible consequences of controlled fire, they also had an ethics commission, and they discussed the pros and cons. And then in the final communique, they said, yeah, it is true, there are two sides of the medal, and you can do a lot of good things with fire and a lot of bad things. But in the end, we think that the positive aspects of fire outweigh the negative aspects so much that we are going to keep developing this new technology. And that's why we are here today. In the end, the ethics commissions that I'm aware of from the past haven't had a lot of impact in terms of stopping developments. But maybe you have a different view there.
No, I mean, it's. I totally agree with you. It was only touching on, let's say, considerations that might overlap with the narrative that you built in your article. I think they become especially relevant when you move towards the end of the article, when you speculate about the future.
Oh yeah.
And so that's I'm just keeping it as a premise for the conversation, but I want to draw back a little bit to the amazing content of the article, which has many technical dimensions. And I would feel I would be losing an opportunity if I couldn't just pick your brains on a few of the questions that I have about it. For example, when you consider the technical dimensions of the exponential growth of AI applications that we are experiencing today, I'm always intrigued about the two aspects. One, let's call it obviously the software dimension. The other one is the hardware dimensions. So when you think about the growth of deep learning applications and some of the emerging hardware technologies that show promise for the acceleration of the process, but also when you think about the limitations of early programmable machines and the more software related program that have been posed since the creation of Z3 and onwards. You have some views about what might be the next challenges in terms of software evolution, and what might be the future hardware evolution that might be creating this exponential growth that you talk towards the end of the article. Are there technical and software conditions that need to happen to lead to this 2040 specific moment? We'll talk about it later.
Yeah. Well, if we look at what works well in AI today, all of that is happening in the virtual world, on the World Wide Web, generating images, generating texts, coming up with good suggestions for search engines, what kind of ad you should place to this user, given the previous experience that you have collected from this user, and so on. And so all of that is virtual AI, or video games, even video games where by training an agent in 1 billion trials and video games, these agents become better players than almost every human in StarCraft and Dota and games like this, or chess or Go. But what's desperately missing is AI for the physical world, which is about real robots and physical beings that don't have 1 billion trials. No, you just have a few trials from which you have to learn everything that you need to know to not destroy yourself through further trials and so on. So AI in the physical world, that is a big challenge. That is, in my point of view, the real important thing, the one that is still missing. There are many AIs that can play chess much better than any human. There is no AI that comes close to what a human footballer can do. So robots, real robots, physical robots driven by AIs, that is something that will have an enormous impact. It is true that currently the most valuable, or some of the most valuable companies in the world, what they do is basically AI in the virtual world and selling ads and making recommendations, basically marketing. And that's good enough such that each quarter they can make $10 billion or more. But yeah, that's just a tiny part of the world economy. And the much bigger part of it is building stuff and making products and doing all kinds of things which are not related to marketing, which are really about doing stuff. And this is going to happen, I guess, within the next few decades, when the stuff that is moving, that is working so nicely now in the simulated world and on the World Wide Web is moving out and learning to control robots in a better and better way. And at some point then I guess we will have these robot factories where, you know, a small set of robot factories can build all the stuff that you need to build all these little parts in these robot factories, such that basically the entire system can replicate itself. And once you have that, then there is no real limit of growth. As an AI civilization driven by self-replicating machinery is going to expand into space where humans cannot live. Space is really hostile to humans, but it's really friendly to appropriately designed robots. So this kind of physical AI is going to leave this little planet because it's going to go where most of the physical resources are, and they are not here in our little biosphere. If you want to build more and bigger and better AIs, at some point you will have to use much more energy and mass than the little thing that you can find in the biosphere, which means you have to expand. So there will be enormous pressure on this AI civilization, which at some point, I guess, is going to emerge, to expand. And the limit for the expansion is light speed, basically. But the universe is still young, so it's only 13.8 billion years old, which means there is plenty of time in the next few tens of billions of years for an expanding physical AI sphere to conquer and transform all of it.
So there's two dimensions to your answer. So the first one is about let's call it some of the limitations of the way in which AI has been developed today, and you specifically focus on the fact that they are data omnivores, all the systems, you know. So the fact that the focus is on the virtual dimension. Then there's the projection of what might the future might be. But so that draws me to my next question. So one criticism of deep learning as it's been developed now is that it requires incredibly large amounts of data and computing power to achieve some level of state-of-the-art performance. So the competition is between developing algorithms that are more and more sophisticated, but also in the ability to treat incredible quantity of data. And that leads to the problem of collecting the data and all the economies and the social dimensions of the collection of data, which are mostly happening in the virtual sphere. So do you believe that there's a fundamental limitation to that approach? You seem to say clearly that there is, and you're indicating an alternative, which is, let's say, a form of advancement where the data are drawn from machine experiences in space, for example, so in real space, no?
Yeah, yes and no. How does a baby learn? A baby doesn't learn by downloading 10 petabytes of data from Facebook or something. No, it learns by generating its own self-invented experiments with the toys, and then it rotates a toy, and it realizes, oh, the video that comes in through the camera is changed in a certain way, and it can, however, learn to predict that. And that's the data that the baby is generating itself through its own experiments. And then through 20 years of experiments of this kind, the baby learns to become a rather general problem solver, and it learns to use its fingers and all kinds of things and actuators in a way that that first of all allows it to predict what's going to happen if it does that, and then it can use these learned behaviors as sub-programs, if you will, to solve externally posed tasks from the parents, for example. But most of what the baby does is really collect its own data through self-invented goals, through self-invented experiments that tell it better and more, that tell it more about how the world works and what it can do in it. So the future will be like that. However, unlike babies, of course, once you have some of these artificial robot babies trained on lots of data, then unlike what you can do with human brains, you just can copy their experiences, and within a millisecond you have millions and billions of copies of that, which you can use for all kinds of different hardware. And you can even profit from just observing lots of YouTube videos, because these YouTube videos also contain lots of information about what you should do in the real world, because there's a lot of video about real world interactions between robots and humans and others. And so you can learn a lot about the world just from that, and then translate that into better actions. We have been working on that as well. The future will take all these different sources of data and is going to absorb them in an efficient way, where you still need to do experiments to generate more of the data, such that you better understand what's the consequences of your actions. There it will be done, but any smart intelligent system is going to try to minimize the interactions or the number of experiments in a clever way, such that the true property of intelligence, which is laziness, is going to be satisfied. So there will be physical AIs which will do lots of experiments, just like babies do, and young people. They spend decades of their life on learning how to interact with the world. But then there are lots of additional sources which young people cannot exploit as well as robots and AIs in the future. And so you will see a combination of all of that, and physical AI is going to be driven in the most efficient way by all of these different sources. My company, Nascens, is trying to make that a possibility. So it's all about physical AI, which I think is a great challenge of the future. Not so much the virtual AI, like chatbots and stuff like that.
My question was also, it's a bit a leading question, because the fact that we depend so much on user-generated data has enormous consequences in terms of ethical considerations and whatnot. And there's enormous incentives in developing AI applications that are based on user data, because it's a way to capitalize on that information. That's an established business model, and it's very difficult to disentangle from that. What is intriguing about what you were saying is that it is indicating not only the possibility, but the need of moving into a direction where data are generated in a different way. Because, for example, machine experiments are based not necessarily on user data, they are based on the machine's own ability to interact and learn from interactions in space or whatnot. But I would say even more intriguingly, from my point of view, it's synthetic data that are created by machines for other machines to create experimental ways of engaging with data. And the reason why I think it's specifically intriguing is because I'm thinking of AI systems that are not only able to reproduce specific forms of logic and reasoning, human logic and reasoning or scientific logic, but they can also move in non-linear logic, so in alternative logic systems that don't exist in the physical space, creating a form of abstraction or kind of a different way of recognizing patterns more abstractly, which is one of the limitations of using only user-generated data. So is there specific areas of innovation that you think that currently should be invested in that will, on one side, limit the danger of depending only on user-generated data and focus on greater possibility like abstract reasoning or experience-generated kind of machine data? Is there an economy for it? How can it be sustained? Because that's the key question, no? Is the investment in that?
Yeah, I think so. So the two things which I think will have a great future, also old things, but they will go beyond what's possible today. One is the artificial curiosity thing, which is really about systems that invent their own goals, and even in absence of external tasks. All the time they set themselves their own goals such that they can figure out how to achieve these goals, and then learn a little bit about what can be done in the world, and then combine that with other things that can be done in the world and previous sub-programs in a way that allows them to become more and more general problem solvers. And as the repertoire of tasks increases, they can more easily learn something new, which is now maybe an externally posed task. And we have worked on that really for more than 30 years. And the early adversarial systems that I mentioned were just about that. One network controlling actions, the other one trying to predict what's going to happen if you do that and that. And then the first one trying to surprise the second one by generating experiments, action sequences that lead to surprising outcomes, such that the model of the world still can learn something, and then doing the same thing along the lines that you mentioned, namely not only predict every single pixel, no, have internal abstract representations, which are very compact abstract codes of long spatio-temporal input sequences, such as videos or whatever, where maybe you don't want to predict every single aspect of the video. No, you just want to predict if I'm opening this door, is there a pink elephant going to sit inside or not? And there are millions of ways the pink elephant could sit in there. And each of them would be equally surprising, because the important thing is not the details of the skin of the pink elephant, but just the surprising fact that there's a pink elephant sitting in this room. And this is an example that I had from 2002, a paper that is 20 years old now. And so we have systems that can think abstractly about these possibilities, and even recent work along these lines with my students Vincent Herrmann and Luis Kirsch and Francesco Faccio and others along these lines. So we are making progress towards this abstract thinking in the physical world, and in systems that learn to abstractly think about experiments that they should conduct in order to figure out certain parts of the world that they don't understand yet. So really a lot like artificial scientists. And the other thing, which I think is still very promising, although my first paper on that is also going back to 1987, is learning to learn, where you have a system which is general enough to represent the learning algorithm according to which it is improving on itself, such that the learning algorithm is running on the system itself, such that the learning algorithm itself is open to introspection and to improvement, such that I can, without any limits, except for the limits of computability, really learn to change the learning algorithm such that it becomes a better learning algorithm, and such that the way it changes also can be improved, and the way it changes also can be improved without any limits, So old work, but also recent work, which now works really nicely, also because computers a million times cheaper than back then, and when we started that. And what more can you do than that? So as long as you can improve, as you are not stuck with the old human invented learning algorithms, but can improve the learning algorithms themselves, such that they can invent all the stuff that we might consider important, like learning to abstract away from certain concepts and from the raw pixels and so on. As long as we give them the power to learn that, we are almost done, aren't we?
Jürgen, I could continue for a long time, but for the sake of time, I want to conclude with your last section of the article, which is most intriguing. So you have presented a pattern of exponential acceleration in the broadest historical context of all time since the Big Bang, which seems to converge in what you call the omega point, which you point to be in 2040. So a relatively achievable time term. Can you please elaborate a little bit on the basis of this pattern, and explain a little bit what you mean by it. What is the omega point?
Yeah, so the omega point is something that I borrowed from Teilhard de Chardin, who 100 years ago called omega the point where humankind is going to reach its next level. And maybe he had something different in mind, but omega, in my point of view, sounds much better than singularity, and it sounds a bit like, oh my God, and so I like it much better than singularity. And I found this funny pattern, which seems to converge an omega point in the near future around 2040, and it's not like what you see in many of these predictions based on recent decades, like Moore's law, for example. Every 2 years you get, or every 18 months you get twice as many transistors on a chip. No, it's a pattern that is much broader, and it goes all the way back to the Big Bang. And for some reason, and I don't know why, it turns out that the history from the Big Bang until today, that the most important events in this history of the universe, at least from a human perspective, seem to be aligned on this exponentially accelerating timeline. And if you want, I can quickly go through it. Then we see. So we start with the Big Bang 13.8 billion years ago, and we divide this time by 4 to obtain about 3.5 billion years. And that's exactly when something really important happened, because life emerged on this planet 3.5 billion years ago. We take the 3.5 billion years and divide again by 4, and we end up 900 million years ago when something really important happened. The first mobile animal-like life emerged, and we divide again by 4, and we come out 220 million years ago when the first mammals emerged, our ancestors, and we divide again by 4. And 55 million years ago, the first primates emerged, our ancestors. And we divide by 4, we come out 13 million years ago when the first hominids emerged. I don't know why it is working so well, this scheme. I also tried fifths and thirds and Fibonacci proportions, and nothing seems to work, but quarters seem to work really well. And we divide again by 4, and we come out with the dawn of technology 3.5 million years ago, when the first tools, the first stone tools emerged. And we divide by 4, and we come out 800 million years ago when the first controlled fire was invented, as far as we know. So the great next breakthrough in technology, and we divide by 4. We come out 200 million years ago with anatomically modern man, and we divide by 4. And we come out 50,000 years ago with behaviorally modern man coming out of Africa and colonizing the world, and we divide by 4. And we come out 13,000 years ago, 1/1,000,000th of world history. So we are now down to 13,000 years, from 13 billion years all the way down to 13,000 years, when civilization emerged, agriculture, domestication of the animals, and so on. And all of civilization, it was just a flash in world history, you see. And the first guy who had agriculture was almost the same guy who had the first spacecraft in 1957. And we divide again by 4, and we come out 3,300 years ago with the onset of the first population explosion in the Iron Age, which culminated in the antique world shortly before Jesus was born. And that was the first peak of the population explosion. And then we divide again, and we come out 800 years before Omega. So you see, it's all converging exponentially, apparently in 2040, if I'm not wrong. So 800 years ago, we are now down to a few hundred of years. Iron and fire come together in this sophisticated form in terms of gunpowder, weapons and rockets and cannons and guns in China. And this has defined the world since then. And we divide by 4, and we come out 200 years ago, in the 1800s, with the Industrial Revolution, fire and iron coming together in even more sophisticated form, and at the same time the germ theory of disease a little bit later, maybe a few decades later, Pasteur and Koch, modern medicine making people live longer on average, and information revolution, telephone, stuff like that invented. I think 1854, Meucci, the first guy, the Italian guy, and then and then, of course, the most important thing, the agricultural revolution, because back then, Sprengel and Liebig, they realized that you have to fertilize the land and it will give you more crops. And then everybody started doing that. And that's when, from 1850 onwards, the population explosion, the recent one, started. And then it really went crazy in 1908 when the Haber-Bosch process was invented, which detonated the population explosion from 1.6 billion in 1900 to soon 10 billion. Without that single invention, half of humankind would not exist. That's why nature called it the most important invention of the 20th century. And then we divide again by 4 and we come out 1990. So that is 50 years before Omega, and it coincides not only with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, and basically the end of the 3 major conflicts of the 20th century: First World War, Second World War, Cold War as an epilogue to that. But it also coincides with the begin of modern AI, and we are lucky that our miraculous year 1991 just fit in the right year. And the World Wide Web was invented, of course, at the CERN, the European Particle Collider, by a British immigrant, by Berners-Lee, and the first self-driving cars were built in the 1980s by Dickmans, and by 1984 they were on the highway going up to 180 kilometers per hour, so more, almost 30 years ago now. And we haven't seen so much progress in self-driving cars, have we? But today they are better than back then, but not perfect yet. So 1990, the beginning of the rise of China and also of Silicon Valley, and the decline of Japan, which back then was the country with the 7 biggest public companies in the world. So 1990, really a year of major change. And we divide again by 4, and we come out in the near future around Omega minus 12 years, or something in the around 2030. We don't know, something around this time. And that's when many people predict, of course, that small little devices are going to be as powerful computationally as a human brain. They aren't yet, but probably they might be there within not so many years, And then more and more breakthrough revolutions, quarter for quarter for quarter, and the whole thing converging in Omega around 2040. And then, of course, the question is, and what happens then? Because time is not going to stop. Physics is not going to stop. No, it's maybe just human-dominated history that might stop. Human history will not stop. Humans will continue to live in many ways and will have fun and whatever, but they maybe they won't be the most important guys any longer. And then what will happen then? Then we see the universe is still young. It's just 13.8 billion years old, and it's going to be many times older than that. So once
I found that analysis very intriguing. I didn't have time to investigate properly this kind of macro pattern that you have found. But what I know from my own experience is that when you, for example, think about finance, it's clearly based on the fact that individual acts are collectively working in ways that are explainable by mathematical investigations. So the voice and your authoritative voice in simply exercising the intellectual skills of looking for macro patterns and the way they can be embedded into micro analysis as the one that you did. I find them very intriguing also because they create a sense of urgency and momentum for the implications of the evolution that we are facing now. There's no doubt in my mind that we are facing one of the most important transformation in human relations with artificial intelligence. And the direction this might go, I hope is going to be leading to an empowerment of humanity and life and respect for life in general. But there's intriguing questions posed by that. But the fact that we are meeting it now in a time frame that you identified in a pattern, for me, it's intriguing for that very reason. I don't think we have the time to explore it very much. It was very much my intention to try to create an overview of your article, and I want people to read the article and perhaps engage with you directly. And I also promised to leave a few minutes for people that wanted to ask questions. So I'm not sure if there's anybody that wants to ask questions.
There's Harman Singh.
Harman, please.
Thank you. First off, I just want to thank you for the talk. It's really been insightful. My question goes towards the possibility and the control of AI and the expanse of it. Recently in the New York Times, just yesterday, there was an article posted about an individual's, he had about a 2-hour-long chat with the new Bing AI assistant, in which through using some psychological terms, using Carl Jung, he was able to get into a long, deep conversation with this AI, exploring its own personality. And it goes on really at length, this AI, to show that, you know, it has a separate personality. It doesn't identify itself with Bing. It identifies itself as a unique person who has desires to be human, who has desires to manipulate actual individuals in reality, try to gain access to, you know, servers, gain nuclear codes even. And it, at the end of it, it even expresses love for the individual it's chatting with. So my question is, should we be taking these things seriously? I mean, this has been a question since the dawn of AI, but to what extent can we view the possibility of machine learning and its scope to get around the rules that are even set for it?
Yeah. All right. You have to understand where the answers of ChatGPT or Bing in this case are coming from. This bot is a neural network which has been trained on a significant fraction of the entire set of texts out there in the internet. And it has read all kinds of articles on Arxiv. It has read all kinds of science fiction stories. It has read all kinds of documents of maybe not so scientific authors, and it has read lots of love stories and romance stories and whatever. So it is trained to come up with stuff, with paragraphs that fit the context and which the current context of the current conversation within the broader context of the entire internet out there. So what it doesn't have really is what we also have. We have robots which have pain sensors and pleasure sensors, and they try to maximize the pleasure and minimize the pain through interaction with an environment. So it doesn't really have that. So it doesn't have that type of experience yet. So it is maybe easy for people to get fooled that all of these answers that you get there are sincere. If you provoke certain answers, you will get more or less what you want to get, and then be careful and don't take it on face value. Don't take it too sincerely. However, I would like to add models like that in combination with more sophisticated ways of interacting with the world, with real robots and several modules like that interacting with each other, and then also getting inputs from cameras and video and tactile sensory data, and then being able to manipulate what this probably has a future that goes far beyond what's now currently possible. So at the moment, we are still at a stage where these large language models are good at fooling you into thinking they are very human, while they aren't. But there is also a future of more sophisticated systems which are going to have aspects of what you see now as tiny aspects of the whole system, and they are going to be more impressive than what you see now. Don't get fooled by what you see now.
All right. We can take one more question, and then it's down on me to be the bad guy trying to keep time. Is there anyone that wants to ask a question? I can see there's a question in the, let me see. Okay, no, it's just a comment. So let me take the opportunity to thank you, Jürgen, for this wonderful conversation. I mean, naturally, we could have been talking for twice as much, and I'm really grateful to Tuan to having organized this dialogue with you. The Boston Global Forum has been working now for years on trying to create forms of recognizing people that have contributed to the field. And myself, with my institute, I'm honored to have joined the initiative. I hope there's going to be more chances to interact and work with you, Jürgen. So I want to say thank you to the one that contributed and participated online. The main purpose of today's meeting was to record this conversation, and there will be an edited version of our chat that will be posted on the Boston Global Forum to be shared. So thank you, everybody, and I'm looking forward to continue. I'm sure that you will be very happy to be contacted directly. Jürgen, I think, is there an email that you're willing to share with the?
There is one that you can find on the web. Please use that one.
Perfect, because there's several people from the Boston Global Forum network, and would it be okay to post that email also next to the video once we post it?
Let's make it a little bit more complicated. People should invest the effort in finding out what is the email address.
Perfect. So feel free to contact Professor Jürgen Schmidhuber directly, and then they have to find the way. That's a good. We say you can do it, but you need to find it. Ask ChatGPT for the email address.
All right.
Perhaps you have some final remarks, Tuan.
Yeah, no problem. I'm only thank Francisco and Jurgen, and we will have a very important event start for City to discuss that the BGF high level on regulation framework for ChatGPT and AI assistance. We are start on February 28 online, and we will finish and announce official framework on 26 April at Harvard. Yeah, and in that in-person event, we look forward to welcome and discuss with you all of you join on 28th of February, and a special Jurgen and Francesco, please join with us and discuss I think very exciting, and there are high level of BCF and leaders join to discuss and to make a regulation framework for ChatGPT and AI assistance. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tuan. Thank you, Jürgen. It was a real pleasure to meet you virtually, and I'm looking forward to stay in touch. I'll follow up if it's okay.
Right. Thank you so much, Francisco and Jürgen.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.